Welcome to the Atomic Shift Podcast. This is Arjun Nidigallu coming to you with episode 4. Thank you for all your feedback on our last episode, 20 weeks to the Octagon, and a lot of great feedback on that MMA fight we posted on our Facebook page as well. That was quite explosive and nerve-wracking to say the least, so if you haven't seen that yet, please go check it out. Now, in our last 3 episodes, we covered mental health, music, and mixed martial arts. Apart from the fact that we're clearly obsessed with the letter M, I can see how it must be difficult to fathom what Atomic Shift is all about at this stage. Of course, you can go back and listen to our introductory episode, episode 0, to get a bit more of an idea. But simply put, our goal is to provide a platform for really passionate individuals to share their ideas, opinions, and talk about their journeys in a way that inspires us all to make those small changes or atomic shifts in our own little ways, in our own little worlds. And in this episode, I speak with one such passionate and eclectic individual in Shane Greenup. Shane has degrees in molecular biology, philosophy, and in the history of philosophy and science. He's a fellow skeptic and a contrarian with some profound views on various topics concerning public welfare. So in this episode, Shane and I attempt to traverse one of the more complicated and taboo topics we could possibly cover: illicit drugs and our views on them as a society. We talk about the history of drug policy, the potential benefits of de-criminalisation, contradictions and hypocrisies that we've harboured over the years, and most importantly, how we can hope to have more nuanced, meaningful conversations about drugs and their impact on our world. Why is this important? Because if there's one thing we can all agree on about drugs is that no matter what we have done over many, many decades, the problems associated with drugs just keep getting worse. So we must at least begin by talking about the issue openly, with a view to understand the problems without any prejudice. A topic like this clearly warrants a number of disclaimers and caveats. Firstly, neither Shane nor myself are drug users, nor do we have any authority or experience in policy making, pharmacology or psychology. So all of our views on the matter are based on our understanding of the evidence we have witnessed. And as always, views and opinions should never be substituted for any sound medical or legal advice. It is certainly not our intention to minimise or misappropriate the very real, serious ramifications of substance abuse, for example. We're rather trying to bring to light those grey areas that we seem to have ignored as a society when we took this clearly unsustainable moral and political stance on drugs and drug users in general. And like all our work, we anticipate this episode to raise more questions, facilitate more debates on the matter, and maybe one day after all those debates, we can finally have a reasonable and healthy relationship with these chemicals that we know will just not go away. So with that long but necessary disclaimer, I give to you Shane Greenup. So welcome, Shane. Thank you for joining us on the podcast. Really appreciate it.
Hi, Arjun. Thanks for having me.
Just as a way of introduction, could you just run us through your background and your specific interest in the topic we're discussing today?
Yeah, sure. I have a bit of a weird background. I studied molecular biology and philosophy and history and philosophy of science, so a double major in arts and a double degree. And then straight out of uni, I just sort of stumbled into entrepreneurship, made some websites, and it's kind of an all-over-the-shop background. But as part of that process, I ended up working on a project called Rebutter that allowed me to... Well, it was basically based on the idea that rebuttal is an incredibly valuable thing. And it's frustrating when you're on the internet and you come across some content that has been rebutted elsewhere, but you are unable to find those rebuttals. And so rebuttal was just connecting these things together so that you could always have access to critiques, and that all sort of came out of my background in both science and philosophy of science. But that sort of thrust me into the world of skepticism and skeptics and fighting misinformation and challenging beliefs, although to some extent, it's just as much an expression of my nature.
Yeah, I want to explore a little bit more about the skepticism you talk about. So is that something you can run us through in a concise way?
Yeah, so scientific skepticism is the idea that any claim is something that should be testable and falsifiable. And so the ideal of scientific inquiry is one where if you have a belief or an idea, you have a hypothesis, your objective is to prove it wrong. No idea can ever be proven true. You can only falsify it. And so that's the objective, is to constantly make yourself less wrong by by finding out where you are wrong and then discarding those beliefs. And so this kind of sums up what skepticism is just this doubt of any belief that you have and willingness to discard it when you find out that it's wrong.
Yeah, and the willingness to change your mind on it, I suppose, especially in light of new evidence and in light of any new perspectives that are arising out there. And drugs, in a way, was that for you? Was skepticism that really drove you towards changing your mind on drugs? Is that right?
That's actually a really good question, because is it? This is the funny nature of all of these rational things. Is that's the ideal. As I say, this is the ideal of science. This is the ideal of skepticism, and someone who has studied it academically and understands the principles and aspires towards them. Did it help me change my mind on drugs, or was it an emotional, social thing?
Yeah.
That's the reality. This is, the flaws of the human brain and our cognitive biases, is we rarely have the rational controls we wish we did.
Yeah.
So in reality, for me, my story of my beliefs around drugs was that I grew up out in sort of working class Australia, and I was raised, with a nice family that were all very good and everything, and raised me the right way. And drugs are bad. People that do drugs, they're losers. They will, you do it once, you get addicted, you'll lose your job, you'll lose your life, you become broke, and you start stealing stuff. That's what drugs do. And I believed it. There was never any questioning of it, really. It was just truth, because it's on the media. Mum and dad said it. Everyone around me says it. And not once did I think about the fact that alcohol and cigarettes are drugs themselves. It's just, and everyone around me was doing those. It was just, drugs are bad. Didn't consider it.
Yeah.
And so much so that, well, as you said, everyone around me was drinking alcohol and smoking cigarettes, but I was the sort of kid that I didn't drink alcohol until I turned 18, and then I tried it and didn't like it, so I continued to not drink alcohol. Never smoked. I hate the smell of cigarettes. It's disgusting to me. And of course, never did any drugs. So I was just I actually didn't like taking paracetamol, because my mind was so drugs are bad that I didn't like any of that kind of stuff. And so it wasn't until many years later that, you go to high school, you go through university, you start making different friends, your life goes down different paths, you meet different people. And I just happened to meet some people that took drugs, and I became friends with them for, completely unrelated reasons, obviously. And some of them just happened to point out to me that, they aren't that way. It's not like that. And at first I'm like, you just take things at face value. I had my beliefs and my biases, and I ignored it and just looked the other way or whatever. But after time, it's impossible to ignore the fact that I've been told all these things all my life about, anyone that does drugs is a loser. You get addicted and all these kinds of things. And I was now spending time with people that were very clearly incredibly successful. CEOs of successful companies, high-paid individuals, sometimes academic professors. And I was experiencing this in countries around the world, because I was traveling a lot at the time, working on my startups and whatever. And these experiences were just shattering, these false beliefs that I'd been raised with. These people weren't losers, and they weren't, as far as I could tell, addicted to these drugs. They were using them like tools, because I spoke to some of them, and one person in particular blew my mind. This guy I just happened to meet while I was overseas at a conference. He'd recently sold a very successful company and was now working in biotechnology space, working on some amazing technology to cure diseases in a way that was mind-blowing. Anyway, a very impressive guy, very intelligent. And he said, when he was a teenager and in high school and university, he would experiment with, some days he'd take uppers to give him more focus and attention to do work, and then take other ones, on weekends, occasionally experiment with psychedelics to increase his creativity. And he literally intentionally experimented on himself to see how these chemicals would affect his performance and capabilities. Now, I'm not saying, hey, everyone go out and do this. This guy was incredibly intelligent and capable, and he was taking risks with his health and his own life. And legally, he's not allowed to do that. But he knew what he was doing, or hoped he did, and it seemed to work for him. So it's not necessarily that I applied some rational principle and realized that, hey, this is what I believed was wrong. But I had experiences, and they challenged my beliefs, and I couldn't continue to hold the beliefs that I had in the face of such glaring counter evidence.
Right.
And that was enough to spur me to start reading more and looking into the science and the evidence for it.
This discussion seems to have exploded in the last 5 years or so, and just so we're clear with our listeners as well, I mean, let's clear up the intent and put in the caveat that we're not through this podcast episode saying that drugs are not a risk or that they're completely fine. It's just we need to see it in a different light for us to be able to deal with the problem that the drugs poses to the society. So
Yeah, absolutely. I do have an unfortunate tendency when I'm having these conversations to get carried away. And a part of that does come from the fact that it's when you spend so much time hearing about how evil and terrible and drugs are, and there is this idea that drugs are only bad, that if you use them, you will ruin your life. They will kill you. I still occasionally talk to people that are completely outside of any connection to drugs and only have that perception of it. And it kind of startles me every time I hear it, because I forget that the average population hasn't done the looking outside of the media, and the media still presents this image of like this meth user, oh my god, they must be evil and they're terrible and they fail their life, and it's so negative that I find myself sort of counter arguing, which then ends up making me sound like I'm being positive, like, hey, everyone use meth. Not my intention. Not my intention at all. Trying to counter the negative. But yes, caveat absolutely that things, meth, heroin, many drugs are incredibly dangerous, addictive.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to give you my take on the topic before we get right into the thick of it, I'll have to plead ignorance on most of it. I mean, I have given very little thought to it, mainly because I'm not a drug user myself. But also, like you said, like most people, I think I've just accepted the notion that drugs are quote-unquote bad. And with that, I know I've ignored any nuance or grey areas that could possibly exist, and I've put people into baskets that make me feel comfortable with my worldview. So this is a great opportunity, this conversation, for me to learn and engage with this important issue. Obviously, you've thought about it long and hard and did quite a bit of research, and hopefully I could step away from what is clearly a dichotomous and fairly ignorant view on the matter. So, and hopefully some of our listeners can do the same. So let's get started, and I think history is always a good place to start. So let's talk about the history of drug criminalisation, aka the war on drugs. So when I think about the term, I think Nixon, the public enemy number one, and the way in which the Americans have really politicised the issue, using it to provoke fear and then not really offering any real solutions as part of their policy. And I suppose it's not that different elsewhere in the world. Across almost all countries, this has been the case. So where do you think this war on drugs that we still engage in today, actually, from a policy point of view, actually originates, and why has it failed so badly?
Yeah, so my understanding is one of the first, or at least in the US, but one of the first anti-drug policies was to illegalize use of opium smoking. Back when many Chinese people immigrated into America to help to be used for labor on the train line and building the railway out to the west coast, and they brought with them opium, which they had used back at home, and so the government illegalized that because, and this is my understanding of it, it's like hard to say, but it's like because white women were being given the drug and then having sex with the foreigners, that kind of thing. So the foundation of the first drug law was just inherently racist and fear-based and political. And that has echoed over and over again in the origin of just about every drug law. When they finally illegalized cannabis, for a start, they kind of changed its name to marijuana because Mexicans used it. And so they were bringing it over the border, and America didn't want that happening, and for racist reasons, you illegalize marijuana, you can now arrest any Mexicans carrying it. Of course, the fact that the non-Mexican and non-Chinese population were using these drugs as well isn't the point. It's that because those populations were using it. It gave the authorities they could find it on those people and go, bang, we've got you for something. So without being explicitly racist in the arrest, they could enforce it on certain races. And so, when it comes to Nixon, that was the ultimate perfect expression of this same phenomenon that had already played out several times, because there is a quote that is recorded, and you can find it online. The head policy advisor to Nixon openly admitting that the reason for their war on drugs was because by illegalizing acid and marijuana in particular at that point in time, they could bust up all of the the beatniks, the hippies, the people protesting the war. That wasn't illegal. They couldn't arrest those people, but they knew that they were using acid. So if you make acid illegal, you can go and arrest your political opponents. Some people struggle with this when I tell them, when they hear about this thing, and if you've never looked into it and you don't know much about the history of drug legalities, it sounds conspiratorial. But hopefully people can, please go and research it if you doubt this. This is not controversial. This is the basis of the laws against drugs is racist and or political. When it comes to the science of drugs, drugs are going to cause harm, the correlation between drug harms and laws is just non-existent. Alcohol and tobacco are two of the most harmful on a personal level and on a societal level, and they're the two legal ones. Other drugs like magic mushrooms and generally the psychedelic class often, and definitely cannabis, are so much less harmful than the legal drugs, but some of the most harshly enforced laws. So the more we look at the science of it and the politics of it, it's really clear that the war on drugs is a politically motivated thing and something that has been perpetuated by political expedience and propaganda. It's such a the war on drugs, drugs won. The amount of money invested into it, the lives lost, the harm done. I don't know if I could back this up scientifically exactly, but I very strongly believe that most of the harms that we associate with drugs is actually harms from the war on drugs. So, lives ruined by drugs is, if not directly a consequence of the war on drugs, at least indirectly. And because the way that lives are ruined by drugs is often related to the fact that people are suffering and addicted and sort of caught by drugs in a way that that it reinforces the problem. And so the drugs aren't the problem, they are the symptom of the problem. But because the drugs are illegal, they have now, unfortunately, sort of placed themselves outside of the law. And so they can't admit the problem. They can't admit the symptom. They can't get help. If they get caught, they get thrown in prison. And now they're suffering with some kind of terrible background, addicted to drugs, and in prison. That's not helping anyone.
That's right.
And then some of the other risks of harms of drugs is impurities and unreliable sources. If you don't know what you're taking, it's definitely not safe. You're buying something off someone who, by their nature, like the people that make the drugs and then transport and distribute the drugs, they're outside of the law. So what is their incentive to worry about health and safety, purity, and other things that are regulated by our government to keep us safe? Drugs are outside of that because of the war on drugs. So when you buy drugs, and people do, and this is the other thing, people do, it's an inelastic commodity. No amount of locking down and trying has stopped people from using it. So this is really important. This idea that, if we try harder, maybe we'll get rid of drugs. Never going to happen. Never has happened. And we've been really, really attentive to this and put lots of effort into it, lots and lots of money, lots and lots of resources. It's like police focus number one every year for decades. And drugs have gotten cheaper and more accessible and more available. But the whole time, the winners of that have been the criminals, the cartels, the people that say don't care. But it's not even whether they care or not. It's that the system that, as it is, puts them in a position where it's in their interest to, since they're outside of the law already, and if they get caught, they'll be thrown in prison. They may as well buy guns. They may as well enforce their cartel with violence. They may as well take risks, because they'll get away with it. What are you going to do? Complain?
You'd think
it's crazy.
we'd learn. Yeah, it is crazy, and you'd think we'd learn from the whole prohibition experiment, right?
Exactly.
And clearly we haven't. And I think that's a good segue into the next section of this discussion, which is the benefits of legalization. And I think as a society, we're moving towards a better understanding of the impact of drugs, if not drugs themselves, from a scientific point of view. And as more conversations like this one happen around the globe, I'm sure we'll start to see this issue in not so much of a black and white manner. One example that indicates this change in the recent past is the UN statement that was released last year, in which it endorses the decriminalisation of drugs for personal use. And this is in light of their overall focus on, public health, human rights, and sustainable development. So despite the backlash on this, and there's been plenty, I think we'd both agree that this is a step in the right direction, reevaluating our priorities based on new evidence and skepticism and all of that. We should be doing that all the time, no matter what our conditioning tells us. But you would believe that decriminalisation is just one step, right? I mean, it's a bit of a, pardon the pun, but it's a bit of a half-baked solution, if you will.
Yeah, it very much seems to me like, for a start, great, let's please decriminalise drugs as a step. But yeah, it does feel like a halfway solution that doesn't quite fix anything. I would just say that I think the current situation, I have trouble imagining a worse arrangement. And that sounds ridiculously extreme. And when I first had that thought, I'm like, come on, try harder. Come on, find a system that could be worse than this. There must be, like, we force everyone to take drugs. That has to be worse than this. Well, actually, I'm not sure, because in reality, if you tried to do that, how successfully could you force everyone to have drugs? What government has the power and the reach to do that? If they tried, pretty sure people would revolt and overthrow the government pretty quickly. So as a nature of that system, it would be self-defeating. What system could be worse than this in reality? I can't think of one, because this claims to be doing the moral good. It claims to be protecting people from this evil, this harm. But in reality, creates crime, creates cartels, creates suffering, and then punishes people for that suffering while claiming the moral high ground. I can't imagine a system worse than what we currently have. So, decriminalise, please. Great first step, because anything is better than what we currently have. But if you're just decriminalising, what are you achieving? You're not really getting rid of the cartels. You're not stopping that black market crime. You're not helping the addicts and the people that have suffering from abuse and suffering in isolation, and the drugs are their symptom, and keeping them outside of society. You're not helping that. And you're not making it easier for society to deal with any of these problems. So if we go the step further to legalization, we can actually start addressing the problems. With a legalization approach, which the key thing is legalization, regulation, and taxation. You basically have to have all three, because you need the regulation, because you, like any pharmaceutical, you need to know it's pure. You need to know it's reliable. You need to know how much you're taking. Like, this is essential. And if you're not enforcing that by laws or something, then people die, because these are chemicals that affect people's brains. You don't take risks with that. Unlike the current situation, which is entirely pure risk. So if you want a decent solution, you regulate the hell out of it, and thoroughly. And it has to be taxed, because you need money. Because you need money to enforce the regulation. You need money to deal with all of the other problems. You need money to do education, because you're going to have to start educating the population about the actual risks of drugs, about safety in use, about consequences. And most importantly, you have to start implementing, not decent, world-class mental health care.
Yeah.
And this is something that no country really has, as far as I know. Definitely not the USA, definitely not Australia. But the problems that we think of as drug problems are, by and large, mental health problems. They are abuse problems. They are problems of trauma and suffering and isolation that drugs address for those people. If you are suffering and in pain every day, heroin is a great way to take away that pain. You stop hurting. If you feel isolated and unloved and worthless and just judged by society and hated, amphetamines make you feel really good. I feel great and accomplished and capable. drugs are solutions to the problems of our brains, which is why they're such amazing tools when used well, potentially. But the second that there is a deep problem that isn't addressed, they are terribly powerful runaway problems. And so the solution to the problems of drugs is largely medical and mental health based solutions. And so the society has to provide that. And in order to provide that, it needs a heap of money. But fortunately, there's this whole black market industry worth billions or trillions, I'm not actually sure what it's worth, but it's a lot of money that is currently going to criminals. And they're getting all of it. Like, governments are renowned for like trying to capitalize on every profit possibility and tax the hell out of everything. Why the hell are they not taxing one of the most lucrative, profitable industries in the world? It doesn't actually make sense, but yeah, I think it makes sense in the other ways, right? The political and historical reasons.
It does, but I think we're hanging on to it too much. I mean, it's a good summary of the benefits because, firstly, it's the priority should be the users of the drugs and the deeper problems. So it makes sense to focus on the education and the mental health faculties that need to be set up to deal with this as we go. But every time you come across the rebuttal that it's going to cost a lot of money, the solution is right there, isn't it?
Yeah. That sort of trinity. You legalize, you regulate, and you tax. It's this wholly contained system that takes care of itself. Colorado was the first place to legalize marijuana recreationally in the States, and the tax revenue that state has seen is just, I think it's like almost tripled their estimates of $100 million. It's incredible. And so, and that's just marijuana. If you, some of these other drugs like methamphetamine, or once you have like a government level interaction with this and you're growing those crops and you're synthetically synthesizing these chemicals, they're not expensive to make. And so the markup that the government is able to take from this, if the government becomes the seller or whatever, like if you do it like the American marijuana system where you've got co-ops or whatever companies, so there's sort of like private industry running it but government regulating it, however you do it, and I don't have the answer to that because that's not an expertise that I even come close to having, let alone want to pretend I do. But how you eventually implement it, you've got to do it. You have to be the biggest failure of history to not generate incredible amounts of taxation money from this. And so anyway, so that money, how I would use it is primarily for mental health and medical care, because you will have to address these problems because it will happen. You legalize it, they will come out into the open. They're already there, but they will come out in the open and you want to address them. Secondly, the education. You have to extensively educate within schools and through the media and also in the distribution process. So, you know, when you buy it from the pharmacist or whatever, you go and buy your heroin or your methamphetamine or your MDMA or your psychedelics, it has to come through a reputable source, and those sources have to have rules about how they provide it to you and have to ask certain questions and give you a pamphlet every time or something like that. Something that will feel excessive and over the top, but it's important to be excessive and over the top because this is a high impact thing. Like there's a huge potential of risk and there's huge consequences because, again, you're dealing with chemicals that affect your brain, and if you mess your brain up, that's you. You know, like, so this is a way of communicating the importance of this. Just because you've legalized it doesn't mean you have told everyone, hey, it's legal now, therefore it doesn't matter or it's inconsequential.
Yeah.
They don't go hand in hand necessarily.
Yeah, and I want to get into more of that, especially with regards to the phasing in of any legalization or some of the counter arguments that we'll deliberate on a little bit later. And I just wanted to ask quickly, Colorado is a great example of where legalization has worked in recent times in a successful way. Are there any other examples that are around the world that you can think of?
Yeah, so Colorado was the first. There's now, I think, 33 states that have medical marijuana or greater. I think there's 22 states that are now fully recreationally legal, which is incredibly fast turnaround from where they were just a few years ago, and crazy how it's still federally illegal. So people are breaking the law and obeying the law at the same time while smoking weed in those states. The US is kind of messed up. And
so if the FBI catch you, you're in trouble, but if the state police catch you, you're not. Is that how it works?
Yeah, exactly.
Wow.
And this is the problem I have with the medical dispensaries, which have been around a lot longer. The feds will raid dispensaries in California. Not often, and usually, and again, this is the political racist basis of drug laws. I think it's the kind of thing that will often happen because, someone wants to take someone out, so they can do it. It's crazy. And then recently, Canada legalized marijuana completely. There's quite a few other countries out there that have done things, and I don't know all of them, but the biggest example is Portugal has decriminalized all drugs. And so it's the biggest experiment of this nature that the world has seen. And they did it in 2001 or something. Like, they did it quite a while ago. So we've got a case study available to us, and it's incredibly positive. Portugal, when they made that move, was facing like horrific HIV problems because of needle sharing in the street. So it was a genuine public health problem. So they did this to deal with that sort of problem, the needle sharing and the hidden aspect of it and the unregulated thing. But like with how I advocate for the legalization process, they didn't just decriminalize. You don't just legalize, you legalize it, regulate it, and tax it. They didn't just decriminalize it, they decriminalized it and put into place extensive measures to provide services to people with addictions problems. They changed the way they policed it all. So even though it's decriminalized, it's still like not allowed or something. Like maybe you're allowed to have like a dose or two of whatever on you, and it's like, okay, you really shouldn't be doing that. Do you need help? Can I send you to a clinic? I'm not sure of the details of that exactly, but if you are caught with it, they will refer you to like Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous or something like that. They will try and get you help to get you to stop using it. They don't actually want people using drugs, but they don't catch you with it and put you in prison. They don't punish you for your personal decisions / your issues. And so as a consequence of that has allowed people to get help, and has allowed them to buy needles or access needles more accessibly because it's no longer as hidden and they're not going to be punished for it. And the consequences have been amazingly positive. The HIV rates just turned around completely, and addiction and the stats aren't coming to mind. I quickly brought up some things, but there's so many studies and so many articles on the transformation of Portugal over this process, and thoroughly studied academic reference studies that you can find, and it's pretty compelling.
Wow, and I think that's a great case study for the rest of the world to look towards and learn from, not just the things that went right, and there might be a few things that didn't go to plan, and hopefully we'll grow from that. And so, look, the benefits of the legalization idea seem like they'd be worth the change on the onset, but I think we'll still face a lot of scrutiny from the general public or the average person, as you say, for even suggesting some of these changes that we're discussing right now. So perhaps we need to first address some of those misunderstandings or gaps that we all have about drugs, right? In your view, what are the kind of things that people generally get wrong here?
Yeah, there are so many things because of the nature of the sort of propaganda that we've been fed our whole lives since the war on drugs began. And some of it now, like, it's funny looking back into the original pieces, the original propaganda pieces, and how absurd they are. Reefer madness, we all laugh at it, but it hasn't gotten much better, this sort of demonization.
Yeah, I remember in high school there was a lot of graphic videos about what drugs can do to you, and they stick with you, right? You're a 13-year-old sitting in a classroom watching a video that's quite graphic about this person with needle marks all over his forearm and being dragged away to the mortuary. I mean, it's pretty graphic, pushing propaganda, and you grow up thinking that that's what all drug users are like, and with that comes a lot of ignorance. But I think one of the prime ideas that I had to get my eyes around was that addiction is not really a moral failing, is it? And these are your words. I'm pulling out of your blog here. So do you want to talk a little bit more about that, maybe?
Yeah. A mind-blowing statistic is that two-thirds of people in prison for drug-related crimes have identified that they have abuse in their past. The correlation between a past of abuse and drug addiction is higher than the correlation between obesity and heart disease. Then that kind of correlation, that is hard to find, like the strength of that in any sort of medical thing that's as complex as this. And we think of addiction as being this simple thing. And this is why, like, you know, on these propaganda campaigns as well, reefer madness is ridiculous, but you know, I think the more recent one on meth is meth, not even once. And it implies that if you ever touch this drug, you will be addicted. And it's just not how addiction works. I understand that it can happen that someone tries it and goes, oh my God, this is amazing, I want to do it again. And then does it a lot more because they liked it and then becomes addicted. And so the first time is the first time that led to that. But maybe the thought before the first time was the first bit, which is I really want to try that because I want something. You know, like it's not the first time that's the thing, and it's not the drug that makes you immediately addicted. There's a lot more to the addiction. There's a lot more before taking the drug that leads to the addiction, and there's a lot more that happens multiple times before addiction sets in. So when we think of addiction, particularly in terms of drugs, people think of it like the drug causes your brain to be chemically addicted to it. I think this is confused. Everything we do causes our brain to have chemical responses. So let's try and step away from that and focus on when you take something like heroin, particularly, you can form biological dependencies. Alcohol is way worse for this. Your body adjusts to having the chemical in it, and if you abuse it and you drink lots and lots of alcohol, or you shoot up lots and lots of heroin, your body normalizes that new homeostasis that it expects to have heroin or alcohol in it. And if you take that away, your body's now out of balance again, and you feel terrible. So this is a chemical dependency / withdrawals. That's not addiction. That is the discomfort of having something out of your system that usually they're propping you up. And so this is the same with nicotine as well. So when you're doing these drugs and you go, I'm going to quit now, and you're struggling with your desire to have it, on top of that, you're now feeling really sick and unwell from the dependency. And that's what makes quitting it even harder. But the struggle to quit it, the addiction, is actually a psychological thing. And the easiest way to split this out is to think of pokies and gambling addiction. People are addicted to pokies. There is no chemical component to pokie machines, but people are absolutely addicted to them. And so the addiction is a psychological, trained phenomenon. It is a desire for that thing, and it comes from the dopamine pathways, the reward system. You make an action and you feel good about it, and you keep reinforcing that until your brain goes, well, this is how I feel good. If I just do this, I'll feel good. And so, like I said, it's still chemical because the brain's chemical, but the chemical in play at this point in time is not to do with the drugs, it's to do with just how the brain works. So when we take drugs, one of the reasons that they're particularly at risk of, some of them at risk of addiction, is because they directly affect the dopamine system. So you take the drug and you feel good. So it's for every other sort of addiction, like porn, if that isn't, but definitely gambling and addictions like that, the dopamine reward system, or food actually is another good one. Food addiction.
Food's a good one, especially sugar.
Yeah. You feel good because of the interaction. It causes your brain to release dopamine. Whereas with drugs, particularly amphetamines and cocaine, you take the drug and they just put the dopamine straight into your brain. So there's a more one-to-one connection to the reward system. But the addiction is a psychological trait. You're training yourself to believe that you need it and you want it. And so the hardest addictions to give up are the ones that have that dependency, so that if you try and give it up, you feel terrible, because that's a negative feedback loop, and socially or habitually conditioned. So this is why smoking's so hard to give up. You've got a strong physical dependency, and it's a social activity that you do with your friends or in certain environments. And so that one of the ways to break addictions is to change your habit or your group of friends entirely. And this is, I think one of the main recommendations for heroin addicts is you've got to change your circle of friends. You have to change your life.
Yeah, I think that's a good summary of the nuance that's involved in this space, because I think there's a general lack of empathy and vindication, personal vindication of people who are going through an addiction, right? And it's quite disproportionate to a lot of factors that we don't pay attention to, like what type of drug is it, and is it a habitual addiction, is it a chemical addiction, is it a dependency? I think we have avoided as a society all of this complication because we have conveniently put all the drugs in the one basket and labeled the basket bad, right? And I think that's an important area that we all need to improve our understanding on, because it is such a widespread problem. Most people know someone who is either doing drugs or addicted to drugs. I mean, it's such a common issue that we can't ignore the complexities anymore, can we?
No, and it's such an important point about, like you just said, we put all the drugs in a basket and labeled it bad. That's only half true. We put all of a selection of drugs in a basket.
Correct. There's discrimination there as well.
Yeah, and that selection has no coherence to it whatsoever. It's not based on harm profile. It's not based on mode of action or on how it affects the brain. Or there's no coherence at all. So we've got the opioids. Like until recently, we could buy codeine over the counter. You now have to get a prescription for it. But it's an opioid, and there's this like spectrum of opioids all the way up to heroin being the most effective. Oh, well, now you've got the synthetics like fentanyl, which is thousands of times stronger. But, you've got this sort of thing where you used to be able to buy it over the counter, and you've got a whole range in between you can buy in prescription, and then you get heroin, and it's illegal and bad. There's no particular reason for that division. Then you've got Ritalin and Adderall that we will prescribe to 5 and 6 year olds throughout most of their life. And I've got no problem with that. I think it's scientifically backed up. But when we do that, it's like, well, this medication, but that's amphetamine. That's speed. It's literally speed. That this is not like, oh, it's the medicine version of it. It's speed. And then you have methamphetamine, ice, does the same thing as amphetamine. They have the same mode of action. They have the same consequences in the body. There's subtle differences. The mode of administration ends up being the stronger thing there. But this idea that methamphetamine is this scourge and this horrible, terrible thing that is a destruction to society, that amphetamine is something that we give to our kids to make them focus at school, and that's okay, is incredibly, like, it's just this weird hypocrisy that no one is even able to see. Like, they're unaware of the hypocrisy because the propaganda is so effective at creating this division that drugs is this group and it's a real group. While alcohol and cigarettes, that's just what we do to relax. Paracetamol.
Hypocrisy is sorry, go on.
Yeah. Paracetamol is not a drug. It's just what you take for pain. And caffeine, I can't get out of, don't talk to me till I've had my caffeine, is a perfectly socially acceptable thing to say. But if I came to you and said, oh, I'm not ready to talk to you today, Arjun, I haven't had my meth yet, you'd be, oh my God, that's terrible. What's wrong with you? Let me get you help.
Yeah.
Functionally, this is degrees of difference.
Yeah. And hypocrisy, I was just about to say, is a fantastic word for this, because it doesn't make rational sense to devise these different drugs in the way that we have. I mean, the lobbyists and the industries, I suppose, can explain some of it. The racial intentions can explain some of it as well. But look, I want to move on to some actual arguments that are probably worth deliberating on more than just the general ignorance that's out there. So
I'll interrupt for 1 second quickly, because
of course,
what you just said there just reminded me of one. Sort of go back to that caveat we started with, and because we're about to go to counter arguments as well, it is worth pointing out, I guess, think that why some are illegal and not. There is a point to, like the example I gave, I haven't had my caffeine, I haven't had my coffee versus haven't had my meth. People can be addicted to caffeine, but the consequences of that addiction usually don't ruin lives. Whereas when you get addicted to the harder drugs, it can ruin lives. But still the distinction, you can get addicted to alcohol, will absolutely ruin your life and does ruin many, many lives and kill more people every day than most drugs kill in a year. So I just wanted to sort of quickly point that out before someone gets all upset at me for comparing caffeine to meth as if they're equivalent. I'm not trying to say that, but it is a weird sort of boxing system that we have, a categorization system that does not have any consistency. So I just want to get that in. Thanks.
Absolutely. No, I think that puts it into perspective, but I think it's a good comparison to really highlight the hypocrisy at a base level. Although when you get into the detail, the complications are quite different. But I think most listeners should be able to understand that. But yes, let's move on to the arguments or counter arguments to legalization that are worth deliberating on as well, because I approached a few people who I know are against legalization of drugs as a principal matter. So I wanted to see what they had to say. So I've got two such counter arguments here for you to rebut, if you will. So the first one is that of the initial effects of legalization. So the first phase, if you think about it, once the floodgates open, this notion that by eliminating the cartels and the smuggling operations, you're making exporting easier, which will initially drive up supply, and because of the demand, the street price will go down, and as a result, people who are current users who can't afford it will consume more as a result, and it also encourage other users who couldn't afford it before to go for it, because now there won't be any legal or criminal disincentives to not do them. And so more importantly, that given the current lack of education and knowledge around drugs and what the boundaries are, it is possible that younger people will be less aware of the side effects and overdose more frequently, maybe, which can have a significant impact on social well-being, economy, and all kinds of things. So how do you see this playing out?
Yeah, there's a few points there that I'll respond to. I think I started at the last thing you said about younger people being less aware of the side effects and overdose more frequently. That's an incredibly important point, and why I think it's absolutely essential that should this policy ever be played out and we legalize drugs, which feels a long way away, but should that ever happen, there's no question that the deliberation process on it would have to be meticulous. The planning, the thought, lots of time will need to go into it. They need to think it all through and implement it as well as possible, and take these kind of things into consideration. And I'd hope that in that process they would see this coming and ramp up and start that education component before the legalization comes in. And so we've seen this, when Colorado legalized marijuana, it's not like they voted to do it and then it happened the next day. There's plenty of time between the decision to do it and the law taking effect. And so it's not like there isn't plenty of educational material available on the internet already or around the world. So it shouldn't be hard to create the educational material that does appropriately inform the population about safe ways to use drugs. And that's something that currently is not allowed to be said in our society, but is actually possible. I think it reminds me, I meant to say this earlier, it's something like 95% of even methamphetamine users are not abusing it and not addicted to it. They use it in a casual sense. And these are the kinds of stats that aren't known in society, because we're presented with this image of if you use it, you're addicted. But I'm sure most people listening to this drink alcohol and are not alcoholics. And if you can do it with some drugs, it's possible to use all drugs. It's possible to use drugs in a safe way. That education component about the genuine way that you can safely use things and the risks still involved in that safe use. There are risks. If you drink alcohol safely, you can get drunk enough to walk in front of a car or think you can drive or try and do a somersault on a beach and snap your neck is a unfortunately common thing that drunk people do. So there are still risks, but that's part of the education piece. And so that needs to be rolled out early on. Very, very important. But as for that early phase where, so early on you've made it legal, but the cartels and whatever have still got their supplies, and so they're selling it, and they're selling it cheaper because they've got less police. See, I think in this legalization scenario, those cartels would still be illegal for a start. So the police would still be enforcing it. You've got 10 tons of cocaine on this ship. That's now ours. Like, it's not like drug running suddenly becomes free game because, and this is happening again in Colorado and those states, the feds and local authorities are still looking for illegal grow operations and illegal sellers because it needs to be highly regulated and controlled. So that should all be against the law still and enforced. So that should still keep the street price up to some extent, I would presume. I should add the hopefully obvious caveat here that I'm no expert on this, on like the social impacts of policy change and any of this. This is very complex, and so if everyone takes this as, this is me speculating, of course. But one of the thoughts on this is if we did legalize it and somehow, and so the street price came down, and the consequence of that, I don't think it's completely obvious that people would consume more. So if the price came down, the reality of the current situation is that anyone that wants to get drugs and just put some effort in can get them, and reasonably cheap. Most illegal drugs end up being a way cheaper night out than alcohol. So if money is a concern, turn to drugs, stop drinking alcohol. Like, that's the current system. So if our drugs got cheaper, it's not that doesn't make sense to me necessarily that, oh wow, drugs are cheaper than they used to be, I'll go and buy them now. If the money was the motivation to start doing drugs, that's already there. And the other sort of, and so for the people already using it, doing more of them because they're cheaper, that's also not necessarily obvious to me that they would, for the same reason that anyone with disposable income doesn't necessarily increase their alcohol consumption. There's like a natural consumption rate that most people feel comfortable doing, and you don't want to get blackout blotto every night of the week, so you don't do it. Not because you can't afford it, but because it's not pleasant. And so for the people that can't afford it, the people that are limited because of their money, I find that problematic in itself, that we're controlling drug use based on whether you're poor or not. Are you so poor you can't afford drugs? Well, you can't do them because that's in your best interest. Well, unfortunately, it is people in poverty that more often than not end up drug addicts, and it's not because of moral failing again, but because they're in poverty, which usually means some kind of family issue because they weren't born into wealth, obviously, and their family haven't supported them, obviously, or is unable to support them, or they've had falling outs with their family, or their family were abusive, and so now they're by themselves and poor, and so they end up becoming addicted to drugs because drugs provide them an escape from their horrible life. In the scenario I'm painting, not saying that everyone in this situation has a horrible life or whatever, but this is a very common story. And so once again, people in poverty, end up being the most addicted to drugs because of reasons, but then we're punishing them by making them pay more for it. So it's a self-feedback loop of negativity.
Yeah, it's a vicious cycle for sure, and I think it's a good point. I think the phasing in of the legalization has to be carefully managed, and we'd probably trust authorities to do that when it comes down to it, and that could solve many of the problems outlined in that one counter argument there.
Yeah, and so we'd have to trust the authorities. We'd have no choice, and even if there is some messiness in that process, and there almost certainly will be because this will be a huge society-changing change, the messiness in the current system is so terrible that any blip in the process is, I believe, without doubt going to be worth it. So
it's a small price to pay in the large scheme of things. I could see that. Yeah. So the second one I've got here is more of an ideological one, and as a social democracy, that there are certain liberties we all need to give up to increase the level of safety for all, right? And we know alcohol is a prime example in this particular example, but illicit drugs can also contribute to the rise of domestic violence. So amongst other social suffering. So given this, would it be worthwhile legalizing these specific drugs in view of the risks?
Yeah, so this is definitely complex. And as you say, alcohol, when it comes to domestic violence, alcohol is the prime culprit. So I think many other drugs can be abused and create suffering, but there is another consideration, is that some other drugs can actually reduce suffering. So with the domestic violence example, cannabis can have a profoundly calming effect on people. in some cases. Psychedelics can cause people to have incredibly profound introspective experiences which change how they relate to other people in incredibly positive ways in some cases. So if we're thinking about a situation of the legalization, I feel like because we just talked about some of this in the previous one, I'm trying not to repeat myself too much, but because of the nature of the current situation is that these drugs already exist in society. So if illicit drugs are going to contribute to domestic violence or other forms of suffering, family fights and breakups and things like that, it's already there. So it's really a question of, is legalizing it going to increase the incidence of use and these consequences?
Yeah. And I guess we have some case studies in Portugal and different states in the US to try and learn from that.
Absolutely, exactly. And with the legalization in Colorado, drug use, marijuana use in teens went down. We've got also examples like Holland, the Netherlands. They have had legal marijuana and mushrooms for decades, at least. And as far as I know, they don't have rampant marijuana use that's disproportionately out of line with the rest of the world. So the difference between the legal places and the illegal places in terms of percentage of the population that use is, I haven't checked this exactly. I can't say completely disconnected, but I don't think the correlation is very strong at all, if there's any. The main determinant of whether a population uses the drug or not, I'm pretty sure will be cultural and just the way that community relates to the idea of the drug. And so this also pertains, like in your last counter argument about increasing the use, like teenagers or whatever, going, it's legal now, I'll use more of it. One of the realities, because of the decades of propaganda, is we have a population that all think drugs are bad and they don't want anything to do with them. And it's a really easy experiment to conduct, is just go and talk to a friend or family member and just say, hey, do you want to do some heroin? And what do you think they're going to say? Oh, that sounds fun. Yeah, let's do that. Most people don't want to do it. So even though it's available, if you say, I've got some here, I'll give it to you free. It's free, it's available, they're not going to get caught because they trust you're not the police about to dob them in. They'll say no 99% of the time because most people just don't want to do it. So just by legalizing it doesn't change that fact. And I think that has been demonstrated by the places that have legalized it, and the use numbers have not gone up substantially. Sometimes they do go up, but that increase is potentially, at least, speculated, reasonably believed to be a consequence of the fact that it's now legal, so people admit to using it.
Yeah, so just want to move on, and I know we've touched on this a little bit already in bits and pieces, so I might just rephrase this question a little bit. So it seems to me that it's high time we accept that the current system is not only broken, but it's actually passively doing more harm than good. So the biggest challenge, I feel, is to shift the perception on the problem. I think that could be an immediate action for everyone. So how do we then systematically go about correcting the misconception? And these people we talk to, they've been entrenched with this idea that drugs are bad almost from birth, right? So how do we break the taboo? And the more directed question here is, how do you approach this topic with people who are completely against it? How do you broach this?
Yeah, I don't even know if I've got a good answer to this, really. It's probably the most challenging problem to deal with. It depends on the person and the relationship, right? People are only willing and ready to hear counter-arguments and things that go against their beliefs when they're ready. And you can't force people to do that, at least on a one-on-one setting. The situation we're in is one of mass media propaganda as a force to be reckoned with, and so the ultimate way to undo that is at a similar level. Ultimately, it will need to come from that kind of high up level. The media need to get on board. So it's kind of a chicken-egg problem, right? We need the government to agree with the science and the evidence and change their policies, but the government will only change it when the population tells them to, and the population won't tell them to until they believe the evidence and the evidence-based system, but they won't believe that until the media tells them that, but the media is equally influenced by politics and the population. So, and this is why I feel motivated to speak up on this kind of an issue, because it's still so underground and still so taken for granted. The average person doesn't think about it. They don't need to. Everything's fine, and they don't do drugs, and people that do drugs are the others, and therefore they can be bad because they don't know them. So what I kind of do is support where I can the little activist movements and things that are happening that catch on. So recently in New South Wales, Australia, we had a big thing about pill testing taking place. And so, that's a very, very important campaign and something that should be supported. Again, evidence-based, but our government, because of ideological beliefs and whatever, was staunchly against it. But I get behind those and support them and share them on social media and make it be known that I support these kind of initiatives and I support these kind of organisations that are trying to educate and trying to get evidence-based policies in place. As you first asked the question, and I sort of replied, how do I talk to people? And often I don't, but when I do, I try to, it's mostly try and be as non-confrontational and non-directive as possible, non-prescriptive, but mostly just indicate that actually my opinion is not so negative. Because usually when it's brought up in a context of a normal person that's never done any looking into drugs and just thinks they're bad, they'll say something like, oh yeah, bloody addicts or users, abusers or druggies or whatever they'll say, and I'll be like, yeah, there's more to it than that, and just sort of show that I don't necessarily think that it's as simple as you're painting it.
Yeah, which you're sort of planting that seed of skepticism in their mind.
Exactly,
and that can be sometimes more powerful than a confronting fact or a expression of concrete, ideology. So just giving people a little bit of an idea of why they should be skeptical is a good way of starting the conversation in the right direction.
Yeah, exactly. Because like I said, people aren't ready to have their mind changed until they are, because this is such an entrenched, strongly held belief taken for granted by the population. They don't even know to question it. And so if you come and say, no, it's wrong, then they'll just fight. You will be oppositional. So the best thing to do is to just, to let them know that actually maybe there's an alternative way to think about this, but I'll leave that up to you. And that's all you can do, is let them find the time. And if they're really curious and they ask, then great, there's a conversation to be had. Most of the time they're not. So there's not much point trying to make it happen.
Yeah, but I think conversations like these, recorded and published, might help make those conversations a little bit easier for people. So that's
so valuable.
That's the hope and the dream, anyway.
Yeah, so valuable. And this is where I think there's one other thing that does contribute to this, and it is the world is turning around already. The legalization of marijuana it's happened so fast now. They've been fighting for it for decades. Legalize it has been one of those catchphrases that's just been around for as long as I've been alive. And it's happening. And that's causing conversations. That's pretty crazy. But what's crazier, positive in my mind, is they've started legalizing psychedelics. Oakland has legalized all natural psychedelics, magic mushrooms, DMT, ayahuasca, mescaline. So, but yeah, the fact that we're getting this legalization happening and legalization of psychedelics as well means that, and because of places like Portugal, means that more and more it's easy to point to these examples and say, yeah, but look, this is happening, it's possible, drugs don't have to be this way and seen this way and treated this way. And when we do change, the evidence very, very clearly shows us that it's beneficial. And as we continue to get that data, it's easy to do. And thanks to things like social media, it's so easy to just quickly broadcast this or to comment it to someone else's dismissive anti-drug post. You can say, yeah, but look what happened in Portugal. So, there's that. Yeah.
You mentioned you share some social media posts on organisations that are doing the right thing in this space. So what are some other organisations who are working tirelessly in the background in this pursuit?
So in Australia, two big ones come to mind. Drugpolicy.org.au, I think is probably one of the sort of central ones. It's pretty clear in the name what they're trying to do. I don't know that they're fighting necessarily for legalization, but so few places are, because it's like whether they think it's the end goal or not, I think it is. it's a hard pill to swallow to go from it's the worst thing ever and anyone that does it is a loser and useless and we need to throw them in prison to, oh yeah, we should totally regulate that and sell it to everyone. That's a big step. So any sensible organisation that's trying to advocate for evidence-based policy is almost certainly going to try and take a smaller first step, just out of political expediency. So Drug Policy Australia, got a quote here: "We believe that legally enforced abstinence is unrealistic and counterproductive in modern Australia, which has one of the highest per capita consumption rates of illicit drugs in the Western world." That's the current state. We have lots of drugs. Abstinence-only education doesn't work for sex education and it doesn't work for drugs. So another really good, crucial organisation is Erowid, EROWID, Erowid. And it's just a website, a archive of all the knowledge on any drug you can think of. It's incredible how extensive it is and how detailed and all the things they cover. So it has everything from trip reports. So you have people that have submitted their personal experiences, written stories about it onto the website. So if you want to know what it's like to experience any drug, you can go there and read lived experiences of them. It links to all the scientific research related to given drugs. Of course, simple summaries of what they're like, what the street names are, just about anything that you could want to know about a drug. You go to Erowid and it has all of it. So it's just an amazingly valuable educational resource that everyone should know about if they're interested in learning anything about any of this stuff.
Yeah, I think it's erowid.org, and I've spent a bit of time on there myself researching this conversation. So, yeah, great resource, like you say, and definitely recommend it.
Another one that comes to mind is Mind Medicine, which is a reasonably recent one, and it's focused on psychedelics for psychotherapy. This is another thing that's helping in this whole process, is breaking the stigma around psychedelics, because finally research is being done to show the value and potential of psychedelics in psychotherapeutic settings to help people with mental health disorders that have been almost impossible, like depression and anxiety, these sorts of disorders we have failed as a society to address, and decades of medical research and effort making incremental progress, which is then questionable if it's even helping or not. And some of these studies show incredible potential for helping deal with near end-of-life anxiety is the big one that came out. And originally there's research to do with depression, with post-traumatic stress disorder, and one of the constant ones that have been around psychedelics is dealing with addiction. It's actually one of the best treatments for addiction there are. Finally, research is being done, and that research is being positive, which is providing this opportunity to talk about these strictly enforced, terribly illegal drugs as actually having massive benefits for society. And so Mind Medicine is an Australian organisation that's telling that story and trying to work with the authorities and with policymakers to allow Australia to participate in that revolution as it comes here. But more important than Mind Medicine really is the organisation that's really brought all this about, which is MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. And I think it was set up 30-something years ago. Basically, when psychedelics and acid were made illegal, MAPS was like, okay, well, let's set up an organisation to start advocating to fix that. And so they've been around all this time and been very, very politically clever to not mess up, basically. Because it was their work that finally got the first study done on acid in 40 years. And it was a few years ago now. And that's the thing that finally allowed this process to begin, where we could start getting more data and evidence on the therapeutic potentials of psychedelics. So yeah, I think MAPS is like one of the key forces behind the legalization of psychedelics in Oakland, for example, and other places are starting to treat it seriously rather than treat them just as these horrifically dangerous chemicals that make people go crazy, which is the stigma they have in our society.
And for me, that's a huge selling point in pursuing this, in that it can actually assist with mental health. And I'm super passionate about mental health, and anyone who's heard this podcast or who knows me knows how passionate I am. And I think just in terms of able to give any sort of help in the mental health space is worth legalising psychedelics in particular. But there's so much mental health work that can be done around this space, because there's such a big causation and correlation between drug abuse and mental health issues that this is something that we all need to start talking about. So just in closing, I just wanted to ask a question, something that I stole from your blog again. If you were in charge, Shane, what would you do in terms of policy?
Yeah, that's so the first part of the answer to that is what I think the key part of anyone who's in charge of implementing policy is get lots of advisors, lots of experts that have dealt with this before. You go to Portugal and you get the guys that worked on that and that implemented it. What did they learn from it? Talk to the people that rolled out, legalization of marijuana in Canada and Colorado. So there'd be a lot of expert consultation and consideration. As I said earlier, it needs to be very cautious and well thought out. So with that very, very important caveat, because I don't have the knowledge to design a good system, so there has to be a lot of consultation. What I think makes a lot of sense is basically you'd need to fund it quite well to begin with. So you'd need to invest so that you can then implement the educational stuff. There are arguments for and against the government being the entire supply chain. The government grows the crops, synthesizes the chemicals, and then distributes it to dispensaries. That puts a lot of control in the hands of government, and some people are against that for various reasons, and there are arguments to be against it. But equally, there are arguments against it being a for-profit endeavor as well. So that's exactly one of those sort of questions that you'd want to have a panel do. And I know some of the solutions to that can be a hybrid model where government does it and they have a regulated rate, and you can also go into competition with the government. But either way, you would need to set up regulations around the process of the creation of the drugs. Who can grow in what context, and how thorough is the security around it to stop it from being stolen and smuggled out. Anyway, it's probably only so interesting in how deep you can go in this, and there's a lot of things to think about, a lot of things to answer. The top level of it is you implement that supply chain, the production, the distribution, the regulation of quality, the enforcement of how people purchase it, and whether people are tracked or not. That's a privacy concern, but perhaps a health concern. If someone buys it too frequently, then it triggers an automatic caseworker to call them up and ask them if they're doing okay. Like, this is potentially incredibly invaluable in itself, though of course it has privacy concerns. But through all that, you've got the taxation starts coming in, and that gets invested heavily into mental health facilities and healthcare facilities, because it's not just mental health but other health concerns, because particularly people that abuse drugs like alcohol and amphetamines and heroin can have a lot of physical damage done to their body. So checkups and other sort of health interventions could be invaluable there too. But the other piece of the puzzle that I haven't mentioned is investing at least a portion of this money, and ideally, depends on how much everything costs, but at least a portion of the money into research, because research hasn't been done on a lot of these drugs. Some of it has been extensively researched, because heroin is morphine, is a medical painkiller, and amphetamines have been used extensively in society. Ketamine is an anesthetic that is used in operations in many contexts. So some of these drugs are actually widely used already. But other ones, like the psychedelics, they're like the most significant impact on our brain, like in terms of experience, in terms of what it does to you internally, the most profound chemicals we know. And they've just been sitting there unresearched all this time, and it's mind-blowing that we as a curious species have allowed that to happen. Our very existence, because all we know of existence is our internal experience, our subjective experience of the world is all we have access to. And we can take this little molecule, like micrograms of a molecule of LSD and have that entire experience turned upside down, and then have everyone go, "Nah, that's not good. We'll get rid of that." And no curiosity. Like, plenty of people have been very curious, but yeah, the research that's possible there, the understanding of how consciousness works, of how the brain works, of how mental health is impacted by it. This is incredibly interesting, and I'm excited to do that. But that would be the final step of the process.
Nice. Well, I think this conversation will continue in the online space, and I do expect quite a bit of response, let's say, if not backlash to some of the ideas that we've discussed and endorsed here. So, how can our listeners follow your work, Shane? Where can we find you?
So I have a blog at just shanegreenup.com. I have not written anything in that blog for probably years at the moment, but a lot of the ideas that I've explored have articles on there that could be interesting to read. I have another Medium blog as well, which is related to my efforts in fighting misinformation and trying to correct false beliefs. It's the larger life mission that I'm working on. In social media, I'm pretty active on Facebook, and a lot of my posts are public, so it's easy enough to follow me on that.
Great. Look, we'll share all those links with the podcast, and also on our channel and on our website, so people can find you fairly easily. Look, it's been a phenomenal conversation and eye-opening for me in many ways. There's a lot of detail and grey area, like I say, that I hadn't paid any attention to, and I'm sure our listeners will find it the same way. Whether they agree with it or not, it's a different matter. But I think we'll realise that there's so much here that we haven't paid attention to as a society and as individuals for so many years. So this has been great.
Yeah, thank you so much for the conversation. I really enjoyed it.